Good afternoon. Welcome to a Nanovic Institute live-streamed lecture on Europe and the ethics of remembering. My name is Clemens Sedmak. I'm the interim director of the Nanovic Institute, and this is, of course, nerve-wracking. Big thank you to the Nanovic Institute communications team, Grant, Connor, and Jen. And obviously, this is a strange situation. I'm staring at myself here at the screen, and I'm all by myself in this empty room. But I will try to pretend that this is working. I will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. 35 should be the goal about this very topic, Europe and an ethics of remembering. The angle from which I want to approach the topic is the common good. My background is Catholic social tradition. I'm really interested in that, among other things. And the common good is an important value in Catholic social tradition. And so I would like to reflect upon the relationship between the common good and an ethics of remembering. And I will use a Nanovic-sponsored trip that I made with students in the spring of 2018. I took 8 students with a Nanovic grant to southern Germany and Austria to look at Holocaust memorial sites. And the frame of this trip was the common good. It was part of the Common Good initiative organized by the Center for Social Concerns. And we spent a week to visit places like Dachau, Obersalzberg, Mauthausen, Hartheim, Ebensee. And the culmination of the whole trip was a 2-hour conversation with Marco Feingold. He has since passed away, but in March 2018, he was the oldest Holocaust survivor of Austria, at that point 105 years old. And he spent 2 hours with us talking about his experience. He had survived 4 concentration camps. The way I want to organize my time is I have preliminary remarks. These were not the preliminary remarks, this was something else. Then I will have 5 points. I want to talk about the political conditions of the common good and remembering. Secondly, about the sensus communis, the shared sense of history as part of the common good. Thirdly, about relationality of the person as a political being, which also means that from a Catholic social tradition perspective, the person is linked to society, and there is a permeability between the micro level and the macro level. Fourthly, about community as a community of persons, where the question from which position do you speak is an important one. And finally, about contributive justice. In Catholic social tradition, contributive justice is an important concept where everybody is encouraged and expected to contribute to the common good. And then I will have some concluding remarks. My preliminary remarks. On January 31st, the Nanovic Institute hosted a memorable event, the Brexit countdown. And that was the day when the United Kingdom officially left the European Union. And we had a wonderful evening thinking about that. And meanwhile, we understand that the United Kingdom has many other concerns. You may have seen Queen Elizabeth's speech, a remarkable speech on Sunday, 2 days ago, where she addressed her people about the situation in the United Kingdom. And I would like to mention 3 points. There was this interesting point in the Queen's brief speech about the moment of anticipated remembering. Anticipated remembering. She said, I hope in the years to come, everyone will be able to take pride in how they responded to this challenge. And those who come after us will say the Britons of these generations were as strong as any. That the attributes of self-discipline, of quiet, good-humored resolve, and of fellow feeling still characterize this country. The pride in who we are is not a part of our past, it defines our present and our future. That's a remarkable first point. Remembering as something that you can anticipate. And those of you familiar with the Ignatian tradition of decision-making know that St. Ignatius suggested if you want to make a decision in the good spirit, think about how you want to remember this decision on your deathbed. So there is this interesting moment of anticipated remembering. A second moment I want to draw out from Queen Elizabeth's speech is a moment of personal authority, which was mentioned in a number of articles on that speech. She said, it reminds me of the very first broadcast I made in 1940. Helped by my sister, we as children spoke from here at Windsor to children who had been evacuated from their homes and sent away for their own safety. Today, once again, many will feel a painful sense of separation from their loved ones. But now as then, we know deep down that it is the right thing to do. So there is this moment of personal authority, of knowledge by acquaintance, where she uses the place she has in her own life and in history to address this very issue. Thirdly, she remembers for the common good. Her speech ends with the words, "This time we join with all nations across the globe in a common endeavor, using the great advances of science and our instinctive compassion to heal. We will succeed, and that success will belong to every one of us." This is remembering for the common good, remembering for the good of each member of the community and for the good of the community itself. And this is today's topic, the European common good and the role of an ethics of remembering therein. The common good is sometimes understood as the sum total of goods produced by all and for all, or also the conditions for the flourishing of a community as a community, or the conditions for the flourishing of each of the members of this community. So that's the common good. And the question I would like to explore is, how can remembering contribute to this kind of flourishing of communities and individual members? And what does it mean to have something like anamnetic flourishing? And for me, anamnetic flourishing means having access to truth and the experience of charity to live well with that truth. So that's maybe the one little claim I would make in this lecture. Anamnetic flourishing could be understood as access to truth and the experience of charity to live well with the truth. My first of 5 points, the political conditions or the frameworks for anamnetic flourishing. The political authorities have the duty and responsibility to provide appropriate frameworks that allow for the flourishing of communities and members. So what does that mean for the common good in relation to remembering? Remembering in Europe has seen different political conditions. In the post-war years, many nations tried to return to national normality as quickly as possible. So they tried to see the two wars as aberrations, as periods of confusion, as something that is not reflective of the normal self of the European. A little bit later, they tried to collect stories of especially heroic resistance to foster a culture of we have a national reasons to be proud on a national level, and to feed those stories of resistance into our national memories. In the 60s and 70s in Europe, you had many people questioning those national narratives and rethinking the interpretation of especially the Second World War. According to Stefan Berger, the following factors featured prominently in this rethinking of history. The recognition of the Holocaust as a major aspect of the war, the highlighting of the collaborationist strategies of governments in occupied Europe, and the acknowledgement of the overwhelming support of the people of the perpetrator countries for their fascist governments. So this led to a new political framework of remembering. From the 1980s onwards, you would see an attempt to have more nuanced stories, to get the complexity off the ground. And one example from an Austrian or German context would be the exhibition of war crimes committed by the Wehrmacht soldiers, who were, of course, members of their nations, but at the same time perpetrators on some level. Maybe a fifth stage has been reached with intentional efforts by the European Parliament and the European Commission to establish a shared European memory project. And this is on the level of political frameworks and political conditions. Let me share a brief personal story with you. I had a visiting professorship in Jena in 2010. And one course I was teaching was Ethics of Remembering and Ethics of Memory. And I mentioned Auschwitz, the famous concentration camp in Poland. And there were 3 Turkish students in the class. And they asked me, what is Auschwitz? We never heard that term. And these were bright, well-educated members of the young Turkish elites asking this question. What is Auschwitz, they asked. And I was shocked. And they told me, well, look, in our school history, we learned a lot about the First World War, but not a whole lot about the Second World War. And in our school books, we didn't learn about Auschwitz. So this is a question of the political frameworks of the school books, basically. A third element I want to mention under these political conditions is the question of the politicization of remembering. Is the correct word? politicization of remembering. For example, Belgium. In Belgium, the memory of the Second World War became a weapon in the struggle between the Flemish and the Walloon parts of the country. In Wallonia, the resistance against the German occupation was glorified, and examples of Flemish collaboration with the Nazis were cited as evidence of the character of the Flemish. In Flanders, the persecution of collaborators was widely portrayed as a witch hunt, and collaboration was often justified as a means to protect the nation from the excesses of German occupation policies. So memory work was politicized, was used for political purposes. The same could be said about the way we remember Kurt Waldheim in Austria. In November, the Nanovic film series screened the movie The Waldheim Waltz, a documentary by Ruth Beckerman, which I call an angry documentary, basically showing one particular side of the story, but clearly showing that there was a political interest in describing Kurt Waldheim's role in the 1940s in a particular way. So this is a tendency in the political conditions of remembering to use remembering for political purposes. And the last aspect I want to mention is the political challenge of moving back to normality. Moving back to normality. Some of you may remember the Walser-Bubis debate in 1998 in Germany, where Martin Walser, famous German novelist, mentioned the Auschwitz scourge and the idea of, well, don't moralize everything using Auschwitz. It's enough. Can't we not move on? His words were much more subtle than that, but that was the main message. And Ignaz Bubis from the Jewish German community basically rejected this idea and told him there is no way back to normality. And this is a challenge where political conditions can make it more or less easy to return to normality or establish some kind of normality. I quote from a travel journal from one of the students, actually I quote from two travel journals from two students who went on a Nanovic-sponsored trip to southern Germany and Austria in spring 2018. So we went to Dachau. And Dachau is, as you know, the only concentration camp that went for the full 12 years of the Nazi regime in Germany. Outside of Munich, in this little town of Dachau. And the student wrote, "My heart was pounding faster when we were in the bus getting close to Dachau. In my mind, this was an isolated and dark place. So I was really surprised when I saw houses very close to the camp. Some of them were right next to it, and their balconies were facing the camp. I thought to myself that I would never want to live in a place that had a view to a setting where such atrocities had happened. Although this is not a judgment to the people who live there, I just found it very shocking that the city had approved an urban development so close to the site that houses were built, that people actually lived there. This leads to a deeper question. What should be done in places like this? How do we incorporate them into life? There is a tension between remembering and forgetting, continuing to feel the pain or moving on and building houses." So that's the experience in Dachau, where we really have a house quite newly built with a balcony overlooking the campground. Ebensee was a small concentration camp in Austria, and a similar experience right after the Second World War. The town of Ebensee encouraged citizens to build their homes on the former campsite. And a student commented, "In Ebensee, where the concentration camp was destroyed, people's houses stand right above the former concentration camp site and overlook the small cemetery, which stands as a memorial to those who died. I understand the need to refrain from judgment, of course. I am not a cash-strapped Austrian looking for a place to live. So who am I to say anything? But I found it deeply disturbing that the history of the place can be so relegated to the wayside that people can just live normally where a concentration camp once stood." So this is a question of political conditions. Summarizing, political conditions giving the appropriate frameworks for remembering for the common good. In Europe, we see changing frameworks for remembering. We see a certain tendency to politicize remembering and memory work. And we see the challenge of political conditions to create normality or electorate. Secondly, the question of the sensus communis or a shared sense. In Catholic social tradition, a shared sense is an important aspect of the common good. Without this sensus communis, this shared sense of what we value and what we deeply care about, it will be difficult to achieve the common good. So what's the sensus communis trying to achieve? A shared sense of history. There are basically two ways of conceptualizing European culture and ethic of remembering. One is the collection model, and the other is the commitment model. Collection model and commitment model. Collection model would mean acknowledging the diversity and similarities in national memory cultures in line with the European Union's motto, united in diversity, with no further aspirations to create a single European remembrance culture. So you collect national narratives and national ways of remembering. That's the collection model. The commitment model is endorsing a collective European memory based on clearly defined historical landmarks with a commensurate commitment involved. The European Union and the European Parliament have opted for this commitment model, the model of we should move towards shared commitments that we have in common in remembering. So there's this idea that the shared culture of remembering is an important part of the unification project in Europe. Let me give you one example. In his speech in 2005, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder made an explicit link between German responsibility for the war and Germany's willingness to work with its European partners for a better future. Schröder recalled his invitation from the French President Chirac to attend the D-Day commemorations in Normandy on 6 June 2004. He recalled the invitation from the Polish President Kwasniewski to participate in the commemoration of 60 years of the Warsaw Uprising, and also the invitation from Russia's President Putin to take part in the 60th anniversary celebrations of the end of the Second World War in Moscow on May 9, 2005. In other words, Schröder described these invitations as a testimony to Germany's desire to build European structures to prevent Europe from being dominated again by war and tyranny. So part of the unification of Germany is sharing commitments in reading history. There are challenges, however, and I want to mention three challenges when it comes to this sensus communis. The challenge of shared categories, the challenge of competition, and the challenge of meaninglessness. Shared categories, competition, and meaninglessness. The challenge of shared categories. Categories, from a philosophical point of view, are the building blocks for any way of or any system of orientation. A prominent example of a lack of consensus on a category is the question of the category genocide with respect to the mass killings of Armenians in 1915 in Turkey. Turkey's president, Recep Erdogan, delivered a famous speech in April 2014 where he expressed his condolences to the Armenians, carefully avoiding a special label for the events and framing the mass killing of Armenians as an aspect of the First World War. I quote, "Millions of people of all religions and ethnicities lost their lives in the First World War. Having experienced events which had inhumane consequences, such as relocation, during the First World War should not prevent Turks and Armenians from establishing compassion and mutual humane attitudes towards one another." So there was a plea towards compassion, coexistence without using the term genocide. The European Parliament, a year later, issued a resolution on April 15, 2015, on the centenary of the Armenian genocide, where it recalled its resolution of 18 June 1987, in which it, I quote, recognized that the tragic events that took place in 1915 through 17 against the Armenians in the territory of the Ottoman Empire represent a genocide as defined in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948. This was a resolution. Turkey's President Erdogan rejected the resolution very forcefully, stating, "We don't carry a stain or a shadow like genocide. We don't carry a stain or a shadow like genocide." Categories matter. Arriving at shared categories is an important aspect of memory labor and a culture of remembering. I give you one example how this could be achieved. A week after the resolution by the European Parliament, Germany's President Joachim Gauck delivered words of remembrance at an ecumenical service in Berlin on April 23 in 2015. He approached the category of the Armenian genocide, underlining the common ground and the special position of the speaker in the German context. He said, "We in Germany have painstakingly and often after shameful procrastination learned to remember the crimes committed in the National Socialist period. Above all, the persecution and annihilation of Europe's Jews. And in so doing, we have also learned to differentiate between the guilt of the perpetrators, which must be recognized and identified unconditionally, and the responsibility of their descendants to engage in appropriate acts of commemoration. We Germans as a whole must also take part in this process insofar as we share responsibility, perhaps even guilt, in the genocide committed against the Armenians. German military officers were involved in planning and to an extent in carrying out the deportations. Gauck made an explicit connection between Nazi Germany and the status of Armenians. When Adolf Hitler, he said, ordered the German army groups to attack Poland and explained his plans to his military commanders in his operation order of August 39, which urged them to kill without pity or mercy all men, women, and children of Polish descent or language. He expected the reaction to be one of collective disinterest, which is why he concluded with the rhetorical question, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? So President Gauck tried to use this common ground of history to appeal to a shared category. And he would also continue by saying, with our present-day knowledge and against the backdrop of the political and humanitarian horrors of recent decades, it is clear to us today that the fate of the Armenians exemplifies the history of mass annihilations, ethnic cleansing, deportations, even genocides that marred the 20th century in such a terrible way. So he tried to show there is a common ground. We do not want to put Turkey in a particular camp. We want to make sure there is this common understanding of history because we share this ground together. Last quotation. The point of remembering for Gauck was the peaceful present. It is utterly important and clearly justified to remember, also here in Germany, the murder of the Armenian people. Descendants of Armenians and Turks live here, and each have their own story to tell. It is important, however, for the sake of peaceful coexistence, for us all to follow the same objective principles when coming to terms with the past. So there's this role of historians, the role of historic objective knowledge, or knowledge about objective historical facts, to make this common ground happen. So that's one challenge of the sensus communis, the challenge of shared categories. Just think of the example of the genocide category. A second challenge I want to mention is the challenge of competition. There are competing narratives, and there is even victims competition when it comes to a European ethics of remembering. So one challenge is competing narratives. There is this parallelism of partly competing memory frames, namely that of the uniqueness of the Holocaust, which has shaped Western European post-war culture, and that of National Socialism and Stalinism as equally evil narrative, mainly Eastern European nations, dominant historic experience in the 20th century. And these two narratives are not easily compatible with each other. That's one issue. A second issue is victims competition. If you think, or if you remember the debates about the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, there was this big question, who suffered most? And should this memorial be only for the Jews who were killed, the European Jews? What about the Roma and Sinti? What about homosexuals? What about people from political descendants? Dissidents, I want to say, from political dissidents. So this aspect of victims not in solidarity with each other, but in competition. One of our students wrote in her travel journal, there has been very little solidarity between the groups. I'm surprised that there has been no coming together after such tragedy to support each other, because only they know what they went through, and that is a powerful thing to share. But instead, they have been fighting about who was more or less victimized. Think about the ethics of remembering and memorializing. This poses a strong question, who deserves to be remembered as a victim? So that's part of this competition question. And another question, by the way, is the competition of narratives, excluding European colonialism and European imperialism in the standard narratives of remembering. There's a lot of focus on the negative foundation myth of Europe and the European Union specifically, the two world wars, but not so much emphasis on imperialism and colonialism as aspects of the German history. So that's a second challenge of shared categories and a challenge of competition. A third challenge is the challenge of meaninglessness. It is difficult, especially for political leaders, to use the idea of there's history and there were moments of meaninglessness in this history. British Prime Minister David Cameron spoke at a commemorative event in St. Symphorian Cemetery to mark 100 years since Britain entered the First World War on August 4, 2014. He appealed to reasons and not only causes and said about the First World War, "We remember the reasons behind this conflict. Too often it has been dismissed as a pointless war fought by people who didn't know why they were fighting. But that is wrong. These men signed up to prevent the domination of a continent, to preserve the principles of freedom and sovereignty that we cherish today." So there was meaning, there was a point, there was a mission, and there were reasons behind it. Another example of meaning making is the speech of Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban on January 27, 2015, at the Kuzma Utka Cemetery, at the ceremony marking the renovation of the plot for fallen Hungarian Jewish soldiers. He made use of the term heroes to achieve the purpose of meaning making. So Viktor Orban said in this speech, 100 years after the events, in Hungary there is still an unjust lack of recognition for the soldiers who fell in the First World War. Even after the fall of communism, history books recounted the battles fought as if there were only victims, but no heroes. Yet, to describe a soldier who falls in combat as merely a victim is unforgivably and unworthily belittling. We must also see them as heroes, because a war which started as one of retribution had by the end of the year been transformed into a true defense of the homeland, in which it fell to our soldiers to drive the enemy away from the threshold of their country and even of their own homes. He ended his speech with the words, "Glory to the heroes." So these are ways to avoid meaninglessness, but even here there are limits. In the same speech, Viktor Orban had to use the categories of tragedy and incomprehensibility to talk about the Holocaust in Hungary. That's painful. In one of the most famous speeches in Germany after World War II, the May 8, 1985 speech by Germany's President Richard von Weizsäcker, commemorating the 40th anniversary of the official end of the Second World War, von Weizsäcker stated, "Most Germans had believed that they were fighting and suffering for the good of their country. And now it turned out that their efforts were not only in vain and futile, but had served the inhuman goals of a criminal regime." So there is an element of acknowledging a lack of meaning. And we are a little bit time strapped here. I would have another quotation from a student who mentioned at the Mauthausen concentration camp site that you had all these monuments from different nations erected to commemorate the victims of their fellow country people. And there were all these slogans. These people died for liberty, or these people died for human dignity. And the student pondered upon this point of, well, there has to be a point to the death of people. We cannot live with a sense of meaninglessness. So that's my second point. The sensus communis, a shared sense of history. Try to conceptualize European history on a common ground with a few challenges, and I mentioned three shared categories: competition and meaninglessness. I will speak for 11 more minutes and end at 1:10 sharply, just that you know. So my third point is relationality of the person and the person as a political being. In Catholic social tradition, the common good is always understood as a personalist category, where the person as a political being needs the community, but the community cannot absorb the individual. So what is the role of the person in this culture of remembering? How do you achieve what could be called commemorative equilibrium between stories and history, between cold data and warm information? A distinction may be helpful here. That's the distinction between the album and the encyclopedia. Harald Welzer for the German context and Cristina Petrescu for the Romanian context worked with this distinction to show each family has a family album. And this album, you collect family memories. And it's quite painful for a family to admit that family members, dear and close family members, have been Nazis or have committed atrocities or been part of the totalitarian regime in Romania. So there is an album aspect of remembering. And the album aspect is much more positive. And Harald Welzer, for example, said, well, if you look at the statistics, about 70% of the Germans would have had to be part of the resistance movement if the album story were true. Most families have, their resistance hero as part of their personal family narrative. That's the album. The encyclopedia is, well, the official historiography, where it was not 70% of the Germans and Romanians involved in the resistance. It were much lower percentages. So this is an interesting question for if you put the person in the middle of remembering, what are pitfalls or traps or challenges? How do you connect stories with a larger context? Italy's President Sergio Mattarella delivered a speech at a ceremony held to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War on November 4, 2018 in Trieste, which, if I may add, that belonged to the Austro-Hungarian World War, Empire until the First World War. So in his speech, Italy's president made a beautiful connection between the overall macro level of history and some personal stories, where he talked about particular women and particular soldiers, just to remind his audience that we are not talking about these huge figures. We are talking about personal stories and faces, and each name counts. And that's a challenge. How do you reconcile the macro level with the micro level? One student from our trip from 2018 wrote in her travel journal, I've been thinking a lot about how to balance the memory of mass murders with the fact that these were all individuals who were murdered. This has obviously been something that the designers of these memorials have also been thinking of, as many featured places of names of those killed at the camps. Mauthausen has a special room of names. Looking out upon, as I walked through, there were so many names that it looked like a pattern etched into the stone. So that's a way in the memorial sites to make sure that we don't fail to remember these were individuals, these were names, and each and every victim has a right to the name and to be remembered in this special way. So this is a third aspect, the relationality of the person as a political being, with a distinction between the album and the encyclopedia, and this challenge for the moral imagination, how to connect the macro and the micro, as Italy's president has done in this one speech. A fourth aspect I want to mention is the community that we talk about in our common good tradition is a community of persons, where it makes a big difference where the question who speaks makes a big difference. Who speaks? Who has the authority? Who has the moral authority? Who has the epistemic authority? And I could say more, but I will just exemplify that looking at two popes visiting Auschwitz. Pope John Paul II visited Auschwitz first time as Pope on June 7, 1979. He celebrated Mass just outside the former death camp. And in his homily, John Paul II said, "Can it still be a surprise to anyone that the Pope, born and brought up in this land, the Pope who came to the See of St. Peter from the diocese in whose territory is situated the camp of Auschwitz, should have begun his first encyclical with the words, Redemptor Hominis, and should have dedicated it as a whole to the cause of man, to the dignity of man, to the threats to him, and finally to his inalienable rights that can so easily be trampled on and annihilated by his fellow man. I am here today as a pilgrim. I have come to pray with all of you who have come here today and with the whole of Poland and the whole of Europe." So here you see Pope John Paul II makes it very clear, I come here also as a pilgrim from Poland, but with a mission that's much larger than the Polish mission. Pope Benedict paid a visit to the concentration camp on May 28, 2006. He avoided using his native German language, except for a short prayer, speaking instead in Italian. In his address, he said, Pope John Paul II came here as a son of the Polish people. I come here today as a son of the German people. For this very reason, I can and must echo his words. I could not fail to come here. I had to come. It is a duty before the truth and the just due of all who suffered here, a duty before God, for me to come here as the successor of Pope John Paul II and as a son of the German people, a son of that people over which a ring of criminals rose to power by false promises of future greatness and the recovery of the nation's honor, prominence, and prosperity, but also through terror and intimidation. with the result that our people was used and abused as an instrument of their thirst for destruction and power. Yes, I could not fail to come here. The speaker and the position of the speaker counts. The status of the speaker counts, and the question, where do you speak from, is an important question in this ethics of remembering. First person singular is connected to the first person plural. A final aspect is contributive justice. From a common good perspective, contributive justice is an important aspect and means every single member of the community is expected and encouraged to contribute. Expected and encouraged to contribute. And I have this one section now on the question, which contribution counts as a contribution? And an example would be silence. You had this remarkable silent genuflection of Willy Brandt in 1970 in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising monument. And he later said this was the only thing he could do. Under the weight of recent history, I did what people do when words fail them. So my contribution was silence. In August 2018, Czech President Miloš Zeman refused to give a public speech marking the 50th anniversary of the military invasion that crushed the Prague Spring in August 68. This silence caused a huge controversy. Chiara De Cesari has a research project where she looks at official European museums and memory sites, and she notes the notable absence of Europe's connections with Islam, Europe's connections with the East. And she says there is intentional silence about these transnational or transcontinental connections and the idea of a purified European heritage that's being produced through a clear-cut separation from what it ought not to be, namely memories of trans-European interconnections and intermingling between East and West. So that's an interesting question of contributive justice. What counts as a contribution and what's the role of silence? A second interesting question is, how do we deal with the pluralism of cultures of remembering? During our trip in 2018, we looked at Dachau and we looked at Auschwitz and we looked at Hartheim. And these are three different memorial sites where Dachau has a very clear structure. You have to have a guide. You will be told how to remember and what to visit in which order. Mauthausen is an open area where everybody can come in. And Schloss Hartheim is a memorial site where they think about the mass killing of people with mental disabilities and other disabilities during the Nazi regime. And Hartheim has an agenda. It wants to remind people of the fact that through abortion, these kinds of distinctions between different types of lives are still going on. And as you can imagine, there were some forceful debates in our group about the instrumentalization of memory sites for certain moral causes. So there's a pluralism of memory sites, and the question is, can we distinguish or can we create criteria by which to deal with this pluralism, which is one of the challenges for the common good at all. Let me summarize and conclude. I tried to mention 5 aspects of the common good with respect to the culture and ethic of remembering. Political conditions and political frameworks, where I talked about changing frameworks, the politicization of remembering, and the challenge of political conditions for normality. I talked about a shared sense of history, a common ground, with the challenges of shared categories, competition, and meaninglessness. Thirdly, I talked about the person as a relational being and the macro level connected to the micro level, with this distinction between album and encyclopedia, and the challenge for the moral imagination, how to negotiate the macro and the micro. I talked about community as a community of persons, where the question of the status of the speaker is very important, and the authority with which you remember is a key aspect, looking at 2 popes visiting Auschwitz. And I concluded with contributive justice, an important aspect. Everybody is encouraged and expected to contribute to memory work. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Nanovic Institute tries to encourage students to contribute to this research and this memory culture through their own research and experience. My concluding remarks are very simple. We need an anetic justice. We need an anetic justice that avoids leaving out important voices. But we also need an anetic charity. An anetic justice is a question of whose voices are left out. And if you look at my lecture now, there was a remarkable lack of women presented, which means European official memory culture has a lot to do with men basically driving the train. But we also need an anetic charity. Richard von Weizsäcker, in his famous speech I mentioned, has this beautiful line where he talks about justice is not enough, we need charity and appeal to charity. We cannot commemorate the 8th of May without being conscious of the great effort required on the part of our former enemies to set out on the road of reconciliation with us. Can we really place ourselves in the position of relatives of the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto, of the Lydysim massacre? And how hard must it have been for the citizens of Rotterdam or London to support the rebuilding of our country from where the bombs came, which not long before had been dropped on their cities? To be able to do so, they had gradually to gain the assurance that the Germans would not again try to make good their defeat by use of force. So we need an amnetic charity so that remembering really means putting things whole again. Thank you very much. So what's happening now is there is a chat. And I have, with these my tiny eyes, look at these tiny fonts and try to read this chat. I have a question from an undergraduate student who asked, should remembering atrocities towards certain members of our human race, for example, Jews in Europe, descendants of slaves in Northern America, etc., necessitate reparations, monetary and or psychological, to future generations affected? This is a good question, and as a good question, I don't know a good answer with the limited time frame I have. I would say 2 points. A, it is difficult to say that you credibly remember if you are not willing to pay a cost for that. So this is what could be called cheap remembering or cheap memories, memories that do not come with implications, consequences, or burdens, which also means it's not enough to say sorry. There's a beautiful book with the title, When Sorry is Not Enough, especially in the context of reparation movements. A second issue, however, is the question of what I call victims' competition. How do you negotiate reparations? There is a rich philosophical literature about that. And at some point, you have to arrive at an amount. It's a little bit like the 9/11 victims and their families. Somebody had to decide, well, how much money will you get? And these are painful questions that may create even further pain. So I think there's this aspect of morality and the ethical aspect of we don't want to have cheap remembering. But there's also the question of which problems do you get yourself into once you open this box? And obviously, many governments are extremely cautious about that and stay on this symbolic level, where I would understand the student's question of saying, well, this is not satisfying. And I leave alone the questions of practicability in terms of generations after slave trade, for instance. How do you negotiate and assess? In the United States of America, you have this distinction between the white settlers who got into easy possession of land, and after 1865, the African American population who got in the possession of much less valuable land. And as James Bailey in the book on asset discrimination pointed out, this leads to discrimination up to the present point in history. So this would be a point to rethink this whole question of cheap remembering. I have a second question here. How do political leaders sufficiently implement humility into remembrance for the common good, as well as placing humility in the discussion of current events? How do political leaders sufficiently implement humility into remembrance for the common good, as well as placing humility in discussion of current events? So for me, humility means two things. It means being faithful to the truth and having your feet on the ground, humus being the ground. And secondly, it means understanding your place in history and being very careful with moral self-righteousness. A wonderful example of that, in my view, is Richard von Weizsäcker's speech, which I mentioned, from May 8, 1985. It was, as he said, his most personal and his most political speech. He wrote it himself from beginning to end because he knew that this would be a milestone in German history. And he was very careful in showing that as a German politician, he had to be humble in approaching the topic of the Second World War. He explicitly said the 8th of May is not a day of celebration, it is a day of liberation. And he pointed out the atrocities done by the Germans and in the name of Germany, and also said that for him, remembering means to make it your own, that it really affects you on a personal level. And I think that's humility. So humility is an attitude where you are very careful with avoiding moral righteousness or the position of being in a place of condemning others. And especially if you come from a context where you have undeniable atrocities, like from Austria, for instance. There is what Pope Francis once called the art of self-accusation, being willing to see fault with yourself. And what we observe presently in Europe is a tendency towards a new nationalism. And tendencies towards a new nationalism don't go well with humility as a political virtue. Assmann, who is one of the most prominent memory researchers and cultural philosophers in the German-speaking world about memory, added 2015 as a milestone in German history, the year of the many migrants and refugees coming to Germany. And she said she observes with a lot of concern new nationalisms coming up after 2015, and these nationalisms affect our national memory cultures as well. And I think this would just be food for understanding the importance of humility also in contemporary issues. I'm looking at the chat. Max Bergholz, the 2019 winner of the Laura Shannon Prize for his book Violence as Generative Force, highlighted the challenge of practicing historical empathy, particularly when telling histories of violence. In confronting the ethics of remembering, how important is it for us to consider not just victims, but perpetrators with empathy? 2 points. One point is, at the end, I tried to connect anamnetic justice with anamnetic charity. And the understanding of justice, also justice to the historical facts, may not be enough. We need more than that. We need this charitable attitude to which Richard von Weizsäcker appealed when he talked about the role of Germany and the fact that Germany has to appeal to a lot of reconciliation and the willingness to reconcile with others. So there has to be this sense of empathy, because my third point about the person as a principle in our understanding of the common good also relates to the perpetrators. The second point is the moral imagination. I mentioned under the heading macro and micro challenge the moral imagination, the term that John Paul Lederach beautifully introduced in 2005 with his book, The Moral Imagination. And John Paul Lederach describes the moral imagination through 4 important capabilities, and I mentioned 2. The first is the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. The first aspect of the moral imagination requires the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. And that's a big leap. Understanding that we are part of one human family, and the line between us as victims and those who are perpetrators is not a line that separates us definitively. We are still part of this web of relationships. The second capacity speaks even more strongly to this question of empathy. It is the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity. I repeat that. It's unusual for John Paul Lederach to be so complicated, but this is a little complicated. The ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity. Dualistic polarity is the polarity between perpetrators and victims. The polarity between Europe and the nation state, for instance. And the moral imagination requires this curiosity to go beyond that, to have a sense of complexity that does not lend itself to being reduced to these binary codes. And then a sense of empathy comes in, a sense of we have come to understand that the Nazi perpetrators were not purely evil. An important voice in the debate was Hannah Arendt in her book on the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, where she talked about her disappointment that she expected to find a monster in court. And there she found a short, kind of polite, soft-spoken person, correctly dressed, with glasses, Adolf Eichmann, who by his signature sent hundreds of thousands of people to their death. And she was disturbed by that. But this is part of this complexity that it's not easy to fall back to the framework condition that we had right after the war. The war was an aberration. These were kind of different people in a different time. It will never happen again because we are so different. And meanwhile, the narrative is much more nuanced. And we know that if you read the book Battalion 101 on the Hamburg police battalion that killed so many Jews in Ukraine, these were Social Democrat voters, decent family members, and they were able to commit those atrocities. And one lesson we have learned, I think, is also in Europe, that it's not them, but it's also us, and it's part of who we are. And so empathy, I would not interpret as you condone, but empathy I would understand to mean inviting us to see the complexity, to move beyond the binary codes that especially national narratives like to use, as I've shown from Belgium or also from Austria. And that's painful because a political discourse that tries to be quick and clear and simplified does not lend itself to those complex categories. So yes, Emetic justice requires Emetic charity, and this is where you have a moment of empathy, not only for the victims, but also for the perpetrators. I'm wondering, this is from Jim McAdams, the former director of the Nanovic Institute and one of my role models. I'm wondering, how does one distinguish between a memory of how things actually were in the past and the fact that people have different recollections of the past? This distinguish between a memory of how things actually were in the past and the fact that people have different recollections. Avishai Magalit at one point distinguishes between shared memories and common memories. And shared memories are memories that we share because of knowledge by description. We have not all been there at, let's say, the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, but we have heard about it, so we share memories about that. Common memories are memories shared by people who were there at the same place. So there were a number of people present, let's say in Austria, 1955, when the state treaty was announced that Austria would be a free country after 1955. And people have these common memories where they were there. So these are two categories, and they have to be connected in some way or another. And I think we need a third category, which is historically memories or memories administered by historians. Because the common memories and the shared memories may not be the ones endorsed by expert historians. And that's what Gauck, for example, said. We need historians to arrive at an understanding of how things actually were in the past. And so I think that there is a slight danger of competition, which you saw when people talked about the war, and you have those who were in the war and those who were not in the war. And that's why we need this. I think we need two things. One, we need these principles of charity towards any type of memory, which is an aspect of contributive justice. Contributive justice do not allow for voices not to be included. Contributive justice is an aspect of epistemic justice. And the opposite of epistemic justice is epistemic injustice, systematically underestimating a person's contribution to knowledge. And this happens quite often with so-called ordinary people whose voices do not count in the expert discourse. So we need that principle of charity towards all kinds of memories that we have. And secondly, we need experts who can help us understand, well, it is undeniable that this happened. There may be different narratives and interpretations, but these are things that cannot easily be denied. Understanding that the distinction between facts and interpretation is not easy. Next question, how can European governments lead their citizens in confronting one of the most difficult aspects of remembering, that of recognizing their ancestors' personal complicity and atrocities of the past? How can governments take an active role in promoting this aspect of remembering? So I can speak for myself. My father was born in 1921. He was drafted and went into the war in 1939. He was a prisoner of war, came back in 1948, and so I'm the son of a person who was definitely involved in some level of atrocities that wars would bring. How can governments encourage people to remember those difficult aspects? Empathy has been mentioned. So governments in their school books, in the mandatory history classes, in the way they train history teachers and professors, can make sure that people have a growing understanding of the complexity. My father was not a Nazi. My father fought on the side of the Nazi army. Was he a Nazi? It's a complex question, isn't it? So that's what governments could do on one level. On another level, they could help us collect those stories. So Harald Welzer, whom I mentioned, the one with the distinction between album and encyclopedia, systematically collected family narratives in Germany and could confront those narratives with more official historiographies. And I think that's another way where governments could fund research into understanding what are these personal narratives and how can we help people understand that it's painful to see this truth. That if you see the truth in its complexity, understanding that it is part of your own story as well, it will be easier for people to make this part of their own lives. Because ultimately, it's about personal knowledge, making this knowledge of the past part of who you are in a way that instills a sense of humility that we talked about, a sense of empathy also with other perpetrators where the images are quite complex. And I remember my history classes just being encouraged to talk about your own family histories and narratives. Just finding a forum that you can exchange with others is powerful. And this is, I think, what governments could do. Lastly, maybe victims' competition is not very helpful. Aleida Assmann famously said, a memory is not an argument. A strong memory is not a strong argument. And victims' competitions do not help our attempt to build the common good through remembering. And that's where I think it's not only one individual government, it's where European governments have to come together to reach this kind of common ground that I tried to mention when I talked about the sensus communis, the shared sense of history. Is there a final question? 1 minute to go. If not, thank you so much for listening to that. Go Nanovic. Keep your interest in Europe alive and just know that Europe has gone through difficult times, is going through a difficult time now, and there will be good times again. Thank you very much.